Let's take a look at how to avoid errors in Excel that may mess with the rest of our financial model. So we're going to use iferror as a powerful way to avoid errors. So let's say, for example, that I've got a hard-coded number here, and for whatever reason it happens to be 0, and I'm taking some other numbers here, like for example the largest expense on our income statement, and I'm dividing it by 0, and I'm gonna lock that in place with F4, the 0, and copy it across, and I get a whole bunch of errors. But if I change this to a 1 or a 2 or a 3, it works. And there may be some situations where 0 only applies to part of the analysis, or you may actually want to be able to enter it. So what we can do here is change this to say equals if error, open bracket, and so we have the function here that we want to calculate. So we want to put a comma to say, so if the result of that calculation is an error, then what should we output? And in this case, let's just say NA in quotes here, and then press enter. And if I use Alt-H-A-R to align right, I have that aligning right. Control Shift and right arrow highlights everything, and I press Control R. So now what happens is, if it's a 1 or a 2, it's fine, and if it's a 0, it just says NA, so I don't get an error message. This can be really useful because there may be down here other functions that are dependent on that number, and I don't want them to necessarily all ref out. So in this case, I get a different type of error message than I got in the one above. So I could also change this to say if error, and I'm going to take this here, put a comma, and then this time I want to change it to a 0 instead of an NA. If I change it to be a 0 instead of an NA, and let's see what happens as I toggle this. Okay, so now what's happening is I can actually continue to build the function, even though I've got an error message that would normally be displayed here and here. I can actually continue to let my model flow through. So this is a very powerful way to not have one error message that might occur here or here impact the financial model down here. So what I'm able to do is just continue building, and I'm not being impacted by what would actually be an error up above. So when it's a 1, these functions would work fine. But if I change this to a 0 and I didn't have the if error messages here, then none of these calculations down here would work. So this is a very powerful way to avoid errors that screw up your entire model. Now the last thing I'm going to do here is just label these rows so we know what's going on here, and I'm gonna just label them as one is dividing by 0 and the other is adding with an error, and then these are also examples of adding with errors. So essentially what you've got now is a clean layout of our financial model. The next thing I'm going to show you how to do is use find and replace to edit formulas. So the find and replace function in Excel is very powerful. If you press Control F, we can do a simple example where we're just going to change text. So let's say, for example, I want to find USD, which I know is in the top left corner here, and it may be in other places throughout the model. But what I want to do is replace USD with CAD. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to then select Replace All. And it tells me that there was just one spot in the model that had it. It was the top left corner. We change it to CAD. I'm going to close that and then just press Control Z to leave it in USD. So that's fine and relatively straightforward, but it's much more interesting to use find and replace to edit formulas. So one thing we can do is that if I want to change this NA here to be something else, I could go into the actual formula itself and change NA. The other thing that I could do that would probably be faster is I could press Control F and I could find NA, and Excel is going to look in the formulas and then replace it with not applicable, and I can replace all, and it tells me that it happened 8 times. So now I actually have not applicable here. I'm going to Control Z, undo that. But you can see how you're starting to get into the formulas. So let's also imagine that I want to change a reference of a cell. So if in these large and small functions here, I want to now instead of referencing cell C53 in the case of small, I actually want to reference B53. I could select this area here. So now I'm doing find and replace within a selection. If I don't have a selection, I'm just in one cell, it will find and replace for the whole sheet. If I have a selection, I can press Control F. What I want to do is I want to look for C53, which has $ around it locking in place, and I want to replace that with B53. And then I'm going to press Replace All, and I can see that there were 7 replacements here. So now it's actually referencing B53 instead of C53 as it was earlier. And this was a very simple and straightforward example, but you can imagine how with a much bigger spreadsheet you may want to start adjusting formulas, and it may be easier to use find and replace to actually change a lot of formulas all at once. So find and replace is a very powerful form of model editing.